As Mr. Antonio Guterres once use of the question, as migration carries incredible opportunities for all the stakeholders if we look at the matter differently. The current context of COVID-19 urges for different policy making in many fields, including the one of migration. The job loss caused by the crisis will undoubtedly cause more people to seek opportunities abroad, even if the cost is their lives. At the Policy Center for the New South, we have always sought to have our vision on the question of migration, a vision that seeks to challenge existing narratives and go beyond the security versus mobility rhetoric. We believe that migration is an opportunity before being a risk. Hence, we aim with our different partners here, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, for the matter of this webinar to bridge and foster a greater debate on the issue. And now, leave the floor to our distinguished speakers and wish you fruitful discussion. And thank you.
Dear Mrs. Rahmouni, dear speakers, thank you very much for the introductory words. It is also my immense pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Regional Program Political Dialogue South Mediterranean of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and it is a privilege to be a partner of the Policy Center for the New South on this very important and timely topic, namely migration and mobility, which is of course a dominant topic of our time, we can say. We just recently published a study on the EU mobility partnerships with the South, and the editor was Mohammed Limam, who is with us today, and we are preparing a new study on migration routes in the central Mediterranean, edited by Professor Boubakri, which is why we are very happy to have those two speakers also with us today. As a regional program, we are always eager to create platforms for dialogue between stakeholders on the two sides of the Mediterranean, which is why it is a distinguished honor for us that we have the member of the European Parliament, Michael Gala, also with us, and of course, experts from the region, from North Africa, who can speak about the perception and the challenges on migration and mobility also on the southern side of the Mediterranean, because obviously there are different perceptions, I would say, between the two shores of the Mediterranean when it comes to migration. We saw, for example, that at the end of September, the European Commission was also publishing a new pact on migration and asylum. And I'm pretty sure that Mr. Gala will speak about the core items of this new EU pact in a second. We are all aware that migration and mobility is a complex issue, and this is why I'm pretty excited to listen to the experts and to their perception on how both sides, how Europe and North Africa can collaborate and work together when it comes to find new strategies on tackling migration and mobility questions, and to see how this Mediterranean region, and for us it is one region, could also come up with common projects, with strategies to tackle these topics as neighbors. And as such, I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Greetings, everyone, from your different corners of the world, and I would like to welcome you again, and thank you for joining us for this next panel discussion. I'd also like to thank the Policy Center for the New South and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for giving us this platform to discuss a very important topic. I'm not alone. I'll be joined by experts and expert of panels who will help us unpack the question of or the theme that will be discussed today on the role of North Africa in geopolitical relations between Europe and Africa, and focusing on the role of migration and mobility dimension. As my previous speakers have already alluded, the topic of migration is not only important, but it's very essential, especially in this era of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we've seen an increased a sense of anti-migrant and populism and extreme xenophobia from different countries. And also for many reasons, it's important for us to know that migration in itself is a very complicated topic that is, politically and diplomatic sensitive, and is influenced by different factors such as the economy, social and political issues. There are no easy solutions when it comes to migration policy or migration in itself. So we're hoping that today we're looking forward to seeing how our experts will help us unpack some of the issues that we can look at when discussing these topics. Our first panelists to help us ease us into the topic of today will be Mr. Hassan Bobraki, and he will be speaking about, and he's the president of the Tunis Center for Migration and Asylum. Yes, and he will be talking about North Africa as a hub for migration. Hassan, I'll give you the platform.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Rio. Merci beaucoup au centre, au Policy Center for the New South pour cette invitation, et bien sûr pour la Konrad Adenauer Stiftung pour leur invitation et pour cette collaboration que je salue. Je rappelle rapidement en 2 mots juste que le travail et la coopération que j'ai avec la Konrad Adenauer date de au moins 25 ans, donc ça fait longtemps que nous travaillons avec le bureau de Tunis de la CAS. Et puis, bien sûr, je rappelle aussi la coopération qui a été coordonnée par mon ami et collègue Ivan Martin il y a 2 ans pour justement réunir les experts autour des perspectives de relations entre l'Afrique et l'Europe. Et ils ont sorti un livre, un ouvrage avec l'Arab Jaïdi. Donc, la réunion d'aujourd'hui n'est qu'une étape, n'est qu'un intermédiaire justement sur la longue coopération, je veux dire, entre moi et ces centres. Et je vous remercie beaucoup pour votre confiance, pour le moment que vous me prêtez justement pour parler du sujet de cette rencontre, de cette conférence. Donc, bien sûr, parler de l'Afrique du Nord, dans le petit argumentaire justement de cette rencontre, vous avez parlé de ponts. L'Afrique du Nord, bien sûr, n'a pas choisi sa géographie. Donc, la géographie, en fait, fait que l'Afrique du Nord se trouve entre 2 voisinages. Et c'est pour ça que nous considérons ici en Afrique du Nord que la question du voisinage est un concept, un paradigme mouvant, et qu'il dépend de la position géographique. Ça, c'est important en tant que géographe. Je rappelle que je suis principalement enseignant-chercheur, professeur à l'université de Sousse, à côté de ma responsabilité dans cette organisation de la société civile. Donc, pour dire que l'Afrique du Nord, par sa position géographique et
considering its geography, is at the heart of 2 neighborhoods.
Sud, je commence, c'est-à-dire l'Afrique au sud du Sahara. Je préfère utiliser le terme l'Afrique au sud du Sahara que subsaharienne, parce que pour moi, subsaharienne, c'est un peu comme si c'est left behind, c'est derrière le Sahara, alors que là, elle est au sud du Sahara. Et l'Afrique du Nord n'est qu'une partie du continent africain. Donc ça, c'est fondamental quand même, tout à l'heure, pour la suite du débat, que ce soit dans mon propos ou dans celui, j'imagine, de mes collègues et amis orateurs et oratrices qui vont arriver. Et bien sûr, notre voisinage nord, qui est l'espace euromède et surtout l'Union européenne. Et je dirais que ce voisinage ou ces voisinages de l'Afrique du Nord ont leurs inconvénients et ont leurs avantages. Leur avantage parce que aujourd'hui, l'Afrique du Nord se situe entre ces deux voisinages pour qui les perspectives de relations et de coopération sont importantes sur le plan humain, sur le plan économique et social, mais dommage, je dirais, c'est le côté des inconvénients, la question migratoire et la manière de gérer la migration et de voir la migration en quelque sorte, je dirais, bloque en quelque sorte ces perspectives promoteuses des relations entre d'un côté l'Afrique et de l'autre l'Europe, et aussi d'un côté entre l'Afrique du Nord et ses voisins du sud du Sahara, et l'Afrique du Nord et ses voisins au nord de la Méditerranée. Donc je crois que la manière dont
that the way migration is managed, chiefly by the African Union as well as the European Union, is dependent on a momentum, a proximity, a vicinity, where everyone would gain in terms of relations and human rapport. Why do I say it does disturb or disrupt this perspective? Because if I look at things from North Africa, from a purely intra-North African perspective, our region suffers from a major handicap or disability where our regional construction has been blocked for a long time. I'm not talking about narratives and treaties, but I'm talking about the implementation of a regional multilateral cooperation in North Africa, which is impeded because of the dispute between Morocco and Algeria on the Sahara. So, in this regard, I would say that North Africa has a chance to develop a regional migration policy where the interests of such member states should normally converge. We have not attained this level as of yet, and that is why it is important that North Africa, because of this impediment or this temporary, or so we wish, disability, we need to have a migration policy that meets our own interests, both in terms of our relations with our neighbors to the south as well as with the neighbors to the north. That is why I do consider that the level of relationship between North Africa and Africa to the south of the Sahara is crucial, because you know that both Morocco and Tunisia are committing on external policies that are very active when we get to the when it comes to the Africa south of the Sahara, and the cooperation is very important. And I would like to say that migration has also turned into a trap in which North African countries are caught in how they manage human mobility and migration flows with their neighbors south of the Sahara. 2 years ago, with Evan, we conducted an effort here at the OCP Policy Center for traditions for cooperation. Are long standing. They've been here for many decades between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, at least Niger, Mali, Ghana. If one just refers to the two African countries in the post-independence period that have attempted to input or to implement an intra-African cooperation framework within the non-aligned movement. And I believe that North Africa should reassign its efforts to this rationale so as to defend its interests as well as to facilitate cooperation and relations with Sub-Saharan Africa by maybe neutralizing, maybe the debate will take me further down the road by neutralizing the effects of European migratory policies on the way North African states have to think their human relations and their relationships, in short, and cooperation with sub Saharan African countries. So, amongst those questions that come to mind, one feels that the countries of North Africa are cloning their migration policies versus the nationals of sub-Saharan Africa. They are cloning European migration policies versus nationals of third countries. That is why during this debate, I'd like for us to go even further so as to explore the way North African states have to rethink their migration policies in two directions. That is, the first one would be to seek to preserve their own interests in their relationship with sub Saharan Africa in a way to protect prospects for future cooperation. And you do know that mobility is a condition for regional construction. The way mobility and migration are being managed, be it in terms of regional policies or external outreach, there is a fear, not just in terms of the relationship between North Africa and the European Union, and also within the sub-Saharan African region and economic blocks. You can see that the way you manage such aspects, it may disrupt uh, regional memento, even though we know that there are some regional economic blocks south of the Sahara that have made a lot more progress in regional cooperation. And there is the free movement of nationals within the ECOWAS, whereas in SADC or in Central African communities, they have made major or greater strides forward, particularly in the Great Lakes region, with countries such as Ethiopia, Kenya, Burundi, Rwanda. And I would like to say, in this regard, that North Africa has much to learn with regard to the way those members of regional communities south of the Sahara have managed to successfully manage the mobility of their populations. And I will end by 2 points. First, North Africa cannot seek to uh, open up the markets in the sub Saharan region without using a reference framework to manage the mobility of skills, of qualified individuals, of tradespeople, and in terms even of the provision of services. If you look at any travel related or health related travel, uh, North Africa has become a magnet for people coming from sub Saharan Africa and seeking medical care. That's just one example, and it's even more complicated because it is related to the issues we have with regard to regular migration onto Europe. Our diaspora is rather solid and is very present in both Africa and Europe. But at the same time, the regional project for the Euro and Maghreb region is still being impeded. We have not made any progress further than what we had attained through the Barcelona Agreement uh, within the Mediterranean. And much to the contrary, with the new pact, European Pact on Migration dated of the 23rd of September 2019, which is being launched, North Africa is experiencing significant difficulties in order to preserve their interests and even to execute and exercise their rights versus North Africa. That is why we have two issues related to rights in terms of the relationship between North Africa and Europe. The first being sovereignty. How is it that the sovereignty of how do you preserve the sovereignty of North African countries when you're under pressure of managing those mobility flows, migration flows, and the second being the rights of migrants, the human rights of migrants, which is a concern shared by both North Africa and the European Union. But one can see that on the field, and because of the pressure generated by the migration crises, at time one steps away from one's obligations versus third countries in North Africa and versus European Union member states. I do not know whether I've used up my floor time. However, I can take the floor at a later point to talk about. I'll put North Africa in the middle and I'll talk about its neighbors to the south and to the north. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that insightful discussion. You were just on time. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to our next speaker. She is Amal Al-Wazif. She's the International Relations Specialist at the Policy Center for the New South, and she will be discussing Bridging the Gap, an emerging African strategy on migration. Amal, the floor is yours.
For the Policy Center for the New South and for the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for organizing such an interesting debate with a very rich panel with distinguished guests. And of course, welcome to our viewers. So before I speak about an emerging strategy or African strategy on migration, I would first like to start with the state of play. And because it's interesting to see how, unfortunately, throughout the recent years, if not the two recent decades, Africa has not been very vocal on the question of migration. It has not been very present in producing narrative about migration, in producing research or scientific research on the question of migration, and that's something so recent report of the International Organization of Migration, and that's very contrasting with the reality, because at the end of the day, it's nationals from African countries who are losing their lives in the Mediterranean, and their governments are to be held accountable for their stability and their safety. Now, when it comes to why Africa is not producing enough research or is not having a common position on the question of migration, we can provide a lot of reasons behind that. Is the fact that Africa is already taken over by so many issues, economic issues, social issues, political issues, and issues related to stability. But that does not mean that African countries lack ambition or enthusiasm to have their voice on the question of migration, or that there are no attempts to have a common and a coherent position on the question of migration. And since the title of our panel is the role of Northern African countries, I think that the example of Morocco is very illustrative in this sense. And if you want to actually think about one big moment of the conception or immersion of an African strategy on migration, I think that the 28th summit of the African Union is a very big moment, when Morocco was designated as the coordinator of a new African agenda on migration and development. And when we look at this African agenda that is still on the conception, of course, and because also of the current context of COVID-19, I think that somehow the priorities have shifted, and we don't necessarily follow the same timeline that was initially meant for the project, but at least we do find finally an African kind of vision on the question, looking at migration not just as a risk, not just as a threatening reality, but also as an opportunity for human development for Africans themselves, and also for the rest of the world, and in this case for Europe. What is mainly the objective of the African agenda on migration and development is, first of all, to debunk the myths, because the myths surrounding the African migration are a lot. And some of them, only to name the main two, is the fact that at the end of the day, Africans are not the most mobile, like nationalities around the world. Most of them stay within their country, and most of the African migration is intercontinental. And of course, everyone now knows this reality because it has been said and re-said in different occasions. And on this, I will second Mr. Boubaker, who said that, of course, there are regions in Africa that are very well integrated, who have their own agreements on the mobility of their nationals. And I can think about the East Africa, for example, community. And there are, of course, regions that are less integrated. And in this sense, of course, the region of North Africa is one of the least integrated. However, when it comes to the role of Northern African countries, and I wanted to speak about the role of Morocco, I think that Morocco, because of what was able to be achieved at the national level, had the kind of legitimacy and also the ambition to claim to play a role as a bridge between Europe and Africa. Why Morocco could play this role is, first of all, because it enjoys very good ties with the European Union. And in this, I would disagree with Mr. Boubaker, because I think that Morocco, for instance, has refused for so many times proposals from Europe that were not in line with its unique and with its national priorities and with its relations with Europe. And Morocco is not the only country to do that. Tunisia has done it as well, when the proposal for hotspots were refused because they were simply against the principles and the ambition of Morocco when it comes to its neighbors in Africa. And of course, the legitimacy also from wanting to play a role in the question of migration at the African level comes also from the success story of being able to imagine and to conceive a national strategy on migration and asylum that was adopted in 2014, and that allowed for Morocco to regularize the administrative situation of irregular migrants in Morocco. And of course, the strategy has the imperative and the objective to reconcile between a security approach, but also a humanitarian approach. The idea is to anticipate the fact that migration cannot be stopped. So we just have to make the choice on how to deal with it, meaning that probably today African countries are not facing the demographic issues or demographic pressures that other countries are facing, but it doesn't mean that they will not be facing them in the future. And one example of this is that the countries in North Africa have already started the demographic transition, meaning that in some years we will also be needing other people to work and to contribute to the development of the country. And this is why the strategy was there, because Morocco in 20 years has changed from merely a sending country to a transit country and now becoming a destination country. This is why it's very important to make the choice to look at the reality of migration and to try to anticipate the issues and challenges that could be brought if the question is not dealt with in a comprehensive way. And of course, when I spoke about proposing the agenda on migration and development, it would be very naive to say that this agenda will deliver in the next coming 2 or 3 years. Of course, there will be challenges, and of course, not everyone will be willing to accept and to receive the agenda without, challenging its basics and without also questioning the idea and the objective of the agenda. But this does not mean that this is not an effort that we should look at and valorize, because it represents the first and concrete step for Africans to make themselves vocal on the question of migration. And another example of that also is the creation of the African Observatory on Migration, which we were aiming to concretize and operationalize by the end of the year. But of course, with the current context, I think that some delays are to be foreseen for the project. And here is also very interesting, we see that for the first time, Africa is aiming to provide its own data on the question of migration. Because unfortunately, it's also about data, it's also about narratives, and it's about how our governments, our decision-making, are looking at the question of migration and how they use it for the development of their countries. So if I have to conclude, I would say that now it's time to give really like space for Africa to provide its vision on the question of migration, and to encourage every attempt in this way. And if we want to encourage it, even from, and now I'm speaking from the EU side, I think that attempt to negotiate other agreements on the question of migration outside of the African Union is not something that's helping this attempt. African governments should take ownership on the question of migration, specifically on the question of irregular migration, because that's an African question beyond all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amal, and for contextualizing some of the issues on migration that we are currently unpacking at the moment. Our next speaker is going to be Professor Limam, Mohammed Limam, and he's a professor at the University of Sousse, and his topic will be on migration mobility partnerships of the European Union. The platform is yours, Mr. Limam.
Thank you very much. Bon, je vais parler en français. D'abord, je voudrais remercier bien sûr les organisateurs de m'avoir invité pour prendre part à ce meeting. Je dois préciser d'abord un petit détail concernant mon affiliation. En fait, j'ai quitté l'université de Sousse et actuellement je suis à l'université de Jandouba, aux frontières nord-ouest de la défavorisée, donc qui avait vraiment besoin de corps enseignant, donc j'ai pris la décision de changer d'université. Voilà. Étant précisé, alors, il m'est demandé de parler un petit peu de la question des partenariats entre l'Union européenne et ses partenaires africains, mais notamment en Afrique du Nord. Il est vrai que l'Union européenne a deux partenariats pour la mobilité avec le Maroc et la Tunisie, mais également avec la Jordanie en 2014. Alors, il y a un point commun à ces partenariats et que les partenaires nord-africains, je ne vais pas parler du cas jordanien. Il y a le papier qui vient de sortir avec la CAS, là où il s'agissait d'une étude comparative entre le Maroc et donc je vais me contenter de parler essentiellement. Pour dire d'abord que l'État concernant les deux accords clés au sein de ce partenariat pour la mobilité, premièrement l'accord sur la réadmission, le deuxième portant sur la facilitation des formalités. Il faut reconnaître que ces négociations sont pratiquement bloquées. Les négociations dans un webinaire tenu vendredi dernier, organisé par en collaboration avec le FTDS, un représentant de la Commission disait que nous allons tout faire pour reprendre les négociations dans le cadre du partenariat pour la mobilité, c'est-à-dire reprendre les négociations sur l'accord de la réadmission et l'accord sur la facilitation. Alors, ce qui m'intéresse ici, pour aller directement au point d'achoppement entre les deux partenaires, c'est essentiellement, entre autres, mais essentiellement la question de la réadmission. Et surtout la réadmission des non-nationaux. C'est-à-dire dans l'accord de réadmission proposé à ses partenaires, l'Union européenne cherche à ce que le Maroc et la Tunisie, et d'ailleurs même la Jordanie, acceptent la réadmission des ressortissants définitiers qui sont majoritairement, c'est-à-dire les ressortissants des pays de l'Afrique subsaharienne. Alors là, les deux partenaires refusent systématiquement cette proposition. À la limite, ils sont prêts à conclure, et encore, le Maroc beaucoup plus que la Tunisie, ils sont prêts à conclure un accord de réadmission sur les nationaux, c'est-à-dire sur les Tunisiens ou bien les Marocains se trouvant dans une situation irrégulière en Europe. Et de là à accepter la réadmission des ressortissants des pays tiers, des pays subsahariens, de l'Afrique subsaharienne, là,
third countries, that is to say Sub-Saharan countries, they categorically refuse. They do so for many
Et
reasons.
il y a une différence entre la position, une légère différence entre la position marocaine et la position tunisienne. Pour ce qui est des arguments communs, on va dire les deux pays refusent parce que d'abord, il y a le problème de l'identification des ressortissants non nationaux qui ont transité par le territoire aussi bien tunisien que marocain. Pourquoi il y a ce problème d'identification?
Countries where there is a problem of identification,
because fact is that the
passage
vers l'Europe,
passage points, the
que ce soit
frontier
au Maroc ou en Tunisie,
points,
se
be
situent
it in Morocco or in
dans des
Tunisia,
zones
are
limitrophes
located
pour le
in
Maroc
areas that are
limitrophes
bordering
à
on
l'Algérie et pour
for
la
Morocco
Tunisie limitrophe
with
à
and
la
for
Libye.
Tunisia,
Donc il y a
bordering on
des
Libya.
bateaux qui partent des côtes
So there
libyennes,
are
mais qui
ships
arrivent d'abord,
leaving the Libyan coasts,
qui passent
but
d'abord
which
par les côtes
which go
tunisiennes
through
pour
the
faire la
Tunisian
traversée
coastlines
vers l'Europe.
to go to Europe.
Donc là, la Tunisie dit, bon, écoutez,
So there,
c'est pas
Tunisia is
possible.
saying,
Comment on
well,
va
that is not something
exactement
possible. How are we
identifier
going to
les
identify
ressortissants
exactly
non nationaux qui
the
sont partis de la
nationals,
Tunisie?
the non-nationals
Majoritairement,
who have
ils partent
left
de la Libye,
Tunisia?
pas de la Tunisie.
Mostly they leave from
Pour le
Libya, not
Maroc, c'est
Tunisia.
pareil aussi. Il y a ce problème-là parce qu'il y a
The
un bon
situation is
nombre
likewise for Morocco
de
because there is
migrants
quite a
irréguliers qui
large number
transitent,
of irregular migrants
passent
transiting.
d'abord par la frontière algérienne
They go first
et
through
traversent
the
une petite distance dans le
Algerian
territoire
frontier
marocain
and
pour
they walk
essayer
into the
d'atteindre les
Moroccan
enclaves
small
de
distance
Ceuta et
in order to
Melilla. Et
reach
là, le
the
Maroc
enclaves
dit
of
aussi,
Ceuta
moi,
and
je ne peux
Ceuta and
pas prendre
Melilla.
la
And Morocco
responsabilité
says, I
de
cannot assume
ces
or shoulder the
migrants-là.
responsibility of these
Il
migrants.
faudrait que
So
l'Algérie
says
aussi
Morocco.
soit
Therefore,
impliquée.
Algeria
Il
must also be
faudrait que
involved.
l'Union européenne cherche
The
à
European
conclure un
Union
accord de
should seek
réadmission avec
to
l'Algérie.
enter into with
Et
Algeria
ça,
a
c'est une
readmission
revendication qui
agreement,
date
and
des
that's a
années
claim
2000, hein, c'est-à-dire
traces back to the years 2000.
Lors du lancement
That is
des
to say,
premières négociations avec le Maroc.
the startup
Le Maroc a
of the
exigé
first
que
negotiations in Morocco,
l'Union
Morocco did
européenne
then
aussi, la Commission,
request
obtienne un mandat
the
de
Commission of the
négocier avec
European
l'Algérie.
Union
Donc il y a
gets
ce
a
premier
mandate to
problème.
negotiate with
Pourquoi
Algeria. There's the first bone of
refuser
contention
la
as to
réadmission
why
des
refuse the
non-nationaux?
readmission of
Deuxièmement, il y a un
non-nationals.
problème logistique aussi.
Second, there is a logistics
C'est-à-dire,
problem there.
supposons qu'on va
Let's
accepter
assume
la
that we're
réadmission
going to
des
accept
non-nationaux.
the readmission of
Les deux pays,
non-nationals.
c'est-à-dire
The two
le
countries,
Maroc et la Tunisie, n'ont pas les
both
moyens
Morocco and
logistiques
Tunisia,
pour
do not
porter
have the
cette
logistic
charge-là.
means,
Et visiblement aussi, il y a un désaccord
charge.
entre
and visibly there is a disagreement
concernant le soutien que l'Union
respect
européenne
to the
doit
support
apporter à ces deux
that the
pays.
European Union should
C'est-à-dire,
give
l'Union
these two
européenne
countries.
avance toujours
The
que,
European Union
oui, bon voilà, nous
have always
mettons
been
de l'argent,
putting forward that we
il y
are
a des
putting money,
enveloppes chaque année qui sont prévues, etc. Mais pour les deux
appropriations,
partenaires, c'est pas
a lot of
suffisant.
money for the two countries,
Donc,
but of course
en
for the
plus de
two
cette charge logistique financière, il y a aussi
on top
des
of the
problèmes
financial and logistics problems, there are also those of
sociaux. C'est-à-dire, par
social
exemple,
nature.
en Tunisie, on a
In Tunisia,
une montée du racisme qui fait
we
qu'il
have
y a beaucoup
an
de problèmes
upsurge
avec
of
les
racism,
communautés
whereby
subsahariennes.
we have a lot of
Donc là
problems with
aussi,
the Sub-Saharan communities.
c'est
There
un autre
again,
problème à
it's
gérer.
another problem
Bon, le
to be
Maroc s'en
addressed.
sort plutôt
Morocco
mieux que la Tunisie
coming out of
concernant
that
la
problem
gestion des
somewhat
communautés
somehow better
subsahariennes
than Tunisia with
présentes
respect to
au
the
Maroc.
managing of the Sub-Saharan communities
Et ça
present in
s'explique
Morocco.
par la politique, par ce qu'on peut appeler la
Could be
politique
explained by
africaine
the
du
African
Maroc, hein.
Morocco-led,
Avec
African-led,
deux vagues de
Morocco-led,
régularisation
African-oriented policy with the era of regularization
Donc,
of
le
the
Maroc quand même gère mieux
aliens,
que la Tunisie.
African aliens
question.
coming to
Mais
Morocco,
toujours
and
est-il,
Morocco
il y a
manages
ce
better than Tunisia
rejet
the situation.
systématique de
But
la
still, there's this
réadmission des
systematic
non-nationaux.
rejection
Et
and refusal
puis,
of the
donc,
readmission of
il
non-nationals.
y a aussi donc, le fait
Also,
que
the fact
le Maroc, non seulement
Morocco,
l'investissement
not only
public
investments,
dans le continent africain,
economic
mais il y a
investments
aussi
in the
toujours
African
en
continent, but
filigrane
there's
cette
also
question
at the
du
backdrop
Sahara et du
this very
soutien
question
politique concernant
of
la question donc,
the question of the
relatif
conflict
au Sahara
relating to
Donc, voilà,
the
donc
Western
pour les
Curtain, Great Sahara.
ça
So
n'avance
as far as
pas,
mobility is concerned, it's not making
entre
any
autres raisons, à
headway.
cause de la question
Among
de
other reasons
réadmission
for
des
the question of readmission
nationaux.
of the
Évidemment, il y
non-nationals.
a d'autres, hein, il y a d'autres raisons. Mais
There are
ce
other
que disent
reasons.
aussi les
But what
partenaires,
also the
l'Union
partners do
européenne,
advance
écoutez,
to the
nous,
European partner is
du
that
moins,
they say, well,
ceci
listen,
est beaucoup plus valable pour la Tunisie.
this is much
Nous
more
n'avons pas beaucoup de
valid
leviers
and true
pour
for
négocier
Tunisia. We
avec
don't have a lot of
les pays
leverages to
de l'Afrique
negotiate with the
subsaharienne
Sub-Saharan
qu'ils
African
acceptent
countries
le retour de leurs ressortissants.
in order
C'est-à-dire, imaginons que moi, la
to
Tunisie,
put the
j'accepte
pressure for the
la
return of their
réadmission des
nationals. Let's say,
par la
Tunisia,
suite,
I do
il faudrait
accept the
bien
readmission of
que
non-nationals, but later
ces
on,
gens-là, ces immigrants-là,
these persons,
rentrent
these
chez eux.
migrants
La
should
Tunisie
also be able to come back in their
avance
countries.
l'argument qu'elle n'a
Tunisia
pas assez de
also
moyens, de leviers
says that it doesn't have enough
pays de l'Afrique
leverages and means to convince Sub-Saharan Africa to readmit also
La
their
solution pour
nationals.
eux,
The
c'est que
solutions for
l'Union
them
européenne
is that the
négocie
European
directement
Union
avec les pays de
negotiates
l'Afrique
directly with
subsaharienne
the
des accords de
Sub-Saharan African
réadmission.
countries also to
Et le
negotiate
problème sera
readmission
résolu.
agreements, and the
Du
problem
moins,
will
c'est ça
therefore
le
be
point de vue,
addressed
hein,
and solved. At least, as I
deux
see it,
partenaires,
these
surtout
are
de la
the
Tunisie.
viewpoints
Négocier
of
directement
the two
avec les
partners,
pays
and
de
mainly
l'Afrique
that of Tunisia, but
subsaharienne.
also directly with the Sub-Saharan African countries.
Peut-être que
Why not?
les
Also,
blocages
maybe
concernant la
the
négociation
stalemates
d'un accord
and
sur la
the
réadmission
bones of contention
seront
on agreeing
levés.
on a readmission agreement
Il y
may
a
therefore
aussi
be
un autre
lifted or
problème
raised.
qui fait
Another
blocage.
problem also
Concernant toujours la
causes
réadmission,
this situation,
c'est que,
still in respect of the readmission,
à l'état actuel des choses,
in the current
ni
state
le
of
Maroc
things,
et encore
neither
moins la
Morocco
Tunisie
and
ne peuvent
less so
être classés en
Tunisia
tant que
can
pays
be
sûrs,
classified as
ni d'origine sûre,
safe
ni
countries,
des pays tiers
neither
sûrs.
of
Les conditions et les standards,
sure
les
or
critères
third sure or
pour
south
classifier
countries,
ces
the readmission
pays-là
standards to classify
ne sont pas
these two
remplis.
countries are not
Même la
really
Tunisie,
met
qui
with.
est
Even
actuellement une
Tunisia,
démocratie
which
naissante,
currently is a
la pratique de
militant
torture,
or
la maltraitance, le
democracy, the
traitement
torture, the
inhumain, etc.,
maltreatance,
c'est une monnaie
the
courante.
human treatment,
Donc, comment
etc.,
peut-on
is something that is
classer ces
legion
pays-là en
in
tant
Tunisia.
que
How,
pays
therefore, can these two
D'autant
countries
plus
be
que les
classified
deux
or ranked
pays
as
n'ont pas
countries that are
encore
safe?
une
More
législation
so,
sur
more,
l'asile. Ils ont deux
more so
projets de
because
loi sur
these
l'asile,
two countries do
mais
not
ils
have
n'arrivent toujours pas à voir le jour
convention or
depuis des
agreement
années
and
maintenant.
asylum. They have
Alors,
projects
comment
that are
peut-on les
staying,
classer comme
gathering
pays sûrs
dust,
alors
if I may say. How
qu'ils
can
n'ont pas de
we
législation
classify
sur
these two
l'asile?
countries as safe,
Donc là
whereas
aussi,
they
c'est
do
un
not
problème,
have
c'est un
any
problème à
legislation
régler
on
avec
asylum
l'Union
seeking?
européenne
Here
qui
again,
est
this is a problem to be
évidemment
solved with the
directement
European Union, which
lié
is quite obviously
avec le rapport
directly
entre l'Europe
related to the
et
report
l'Afrique.
between Europe and Africa.
Évidemment aussi,
Quite obviously.
et là je rebondis,
Also,
je sors un
and
petit
here
peu
I'd
du
like to
cadre
echo
de
back
l'accord
on what
sur
was
la
said, and I'm
mobilité,
coming
parce
out
que
from the agreement on mobility.
L'objet de ce meeting,
Because the
c'est
subject
le rapport
matter of
bien
this
le
meeting
bridge
is
que
the
peut
report or the bridge that
constituer l'Afrique du Nord par rapport
North
entre
Africa
l'Union
can
européenne et
constitute
l'Afrique
between the
subsaharienne.
European
Là, je
Union
me
and
réfère à
Sub-Saharan
une
Africa.
étude qui a
And
été
here I
faite
refer you to
en
a study
2017
that was conducted in
sur
2017 on
sur la Migration Policy Framework,
Migration
for
Policy
Africa.
Framework in North
Et
Africa.
c'était une évaluation,
was
c'était une
An
enquête
assessment.
sur
It
le
was
degré
a study conducted on
d'appropriation de la
the degree
stratégie
of
de l'Union
take-up or
africaine en
ownership
matière
of
migratoire.
the African
Et voir à
Union-led
quel
strategy
point
in
les pays
migratory
africains
questions, and to see as to
s'approprient
what
cette
level the
stratégie
African countries are
pour faire
taking up
face
or
en
taking
bloc,
ownership of the strategy in order as a
vis-à-vis
bloc
de
to
l'Union
face
européenne.
the
Alors,
European
les
Union.
résultats de cette,
Now, the result
de cette étude-là,
of the study
à laquelle j'ai participé
to which I did take part, or in which I did take part as
expert pour faire donc l'investigation sur l'Afrique
to
du
conduct
Nord.
investigations
Il s'est
in North
avéré
Africa. Well, it
que
turned
les pays
out
de l'Afrique du Nord
that the North African countries
ne s'intéressent même pas à la stratégie de
are
l'Union
not
africaine en
even
matière
showing
migratoire.
any interest in the
Les autorités,
African Union strategy in
les pouvoirs
migratory
publics,
matters.
même
The
les ONG,
authorities,
la
the public
société
powers, even
civile,
the NGOs and
ne
CSOs,
s'intéressent
society
pas à
organizations,
cette
are not
stratégie de
really
l'Union
showing any
africaine.
interest in the strategy
Leur
that is
intérêt,
led
leur
by the African
priorité,
Union. Their
c'est
interest, their
l'Union européenne,
priorities
ce sont les
is the
négociations
European
avec l'Union
Union,
européenne,
the
les problèmes qui
negotiations
se
with the
posent
European
avec
Union,
l'Union
the problems
européenne.
that are current here and there
Et
with
donc,
the European
il
Union.
n'y a pas
Hence,
d'appropriation
for
de
them,
cette
there is
stratégie.
no ownership being
Un autre
taken of the
élément qui fait
strategy.
qu'il n'y a
Another
pas
component also
d'appropriation
that
de la stratégie de l'Union
causes the
africaine,
lack of
c'est
take-up
qu'il
or
n'y a pas,
ownership
il
of the
n'existe pas les mêmes
African
priorités
Union
entre
strategy
l'Afrique du
is
Nord
the
et
fact
les
that
pays
between North
d'Afrique
Africa
subsaharienne.
and Sub-Saharan Africa
Il
do not
s'avère,
share
d'après
the same priorities. It turns out,
les
according to this
priorités pour l'Afrique
assessment, that the
subsaharienne, ce sont des
priorities for Sub-Saharan Africa
priorités
are
qui s'expriment en termes de
priorities
développement
that are being
et surtout
in terms of development,
en matière de
and
transfert,
mostly when it comes to
remittances. Ce sont là des problèmes qui intéressent
transfer of
l'Afrique
remittances. So
subsaharienne.
these are the
Alors
problems that are of
que
interest for
pour
Sub-Saharan
les
Africa,
pays de
whereas for the
l'Afrique du Nord, c'est
North
toujours la
African countries,
coopération avec
it
l'Union
is always the
européenne
cooperation with
concernant
the
la
European
gestion
Union pertaining
de
to
la question
the,
migratoire, c'est-à-dire
say, the management of migratory
la lutte
question,
contre
i.e. fighting
l'immigration
irregular,
irrégulière et la question de la réadmission. Donc,
illegal migration and the question of
voilà,
readmission.
il y a un problème. Lorsqu'on parle de l'Afrique du Nord en tant que bridge, en tant que pont entre l'Europe et l'Afrique subsaharienne, il y a encore du chemin à faire. Il y a encore beaucoup de travail à faire déjà entre l'Afrique du Nord et l'Afrique subsaharienne. À tel point que là, on se le dit, c'est vrai qu'on ne le dit pas assez souvent et assez ouvertement. L'Afrique du Nord n'est pas considérée comme faisant partie de l'Afrique, comme c'est le cas pour les pays arabes. L'Afrique du Nord n'est pas considérée comme faisant partie il y a toujours ce problème-là. Et donc, il y a un travail à faire entre l'Afrique du Nord et les pays de l'Afrique subsaharienne pour réellement monter une stratégie commune, peut-être l'agenda de 2063,
the agenda of 2063 that was proposed
une bonne base
could also be a good foundation to build on.
Et puis par la suite,
that work together, and thereafter, at a second stage,
il faut
we have to look to
penser quel type de stratégie
about what type of
on
strategy,
peut mettre en
what
place
types of
ensemble,
strategy we can put
toute
together,
l'Union,
all Africa vis-à-vis the European Union.
Si j'ai encore quelques secondes, je dirais, pour conclure, je dirais que l'Union européenne ne facilite pas le travail. Elle traite d'une manière très différenciée entre les pays de l'Afrique, que ce soit
the African countries, be it North African or Sub-Saharan African countries, the multiplication of the regional, continental cooperation framework, not to mention the international, it's a real cacophony, it's an institutional snafu, if I may use the expression, which is not likely or which might not foster a coherent and consistent strategy of Africa vis-à-vis the
européenne
European
et
Union,
le pacte sur la migration et l'asile
migration
sorti dernièrement
asylum
en septembre
has come out on the 23rd of September recently is the compact or that agreement really turns a blind eye or a deaf ear on the question of the cooperation between the European Union and Africa as such, as a compact bloc, but rather it always prefers to really focus the attention on North African countries and the problems of migration. Thank you. Thank you for kind attention.
Thank you, Mr. Mohamed Limam.
Merci.
I will move on to our next speaker, Mr. Ivan Martin. He's the Senior Fellow Policy Center. He's a Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and he will be discussing what prospects and implications for Europe-North Africa partnerships, what role for migration in partnership. Mr. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Céline Dillet. I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to enumerate 12 points, actually 3 constraints, 4 things not to do things, and 4 points for action. And all considering that we are in a quite crucial moment at the crossroads, because the EU-Africa partnership is currently being discussed and negotiated. The post-Cotonou agreement as well, it should be concluded by the end of the year, even if probably it will not happen. The Euro-Mediterranean Partnership is celebrating the 25th anniversary in 2 months, and there are some conversations to relaunch it. and the multi-annual financial framework of the European Union has been approved for the next 7 years, including, of course, all the financial resources for the European neighborhood policy. What we know for sure, the three constraints, I think, are important starting points for our discussion. First, the demographic constraint. I think that it can be stated without any doubt.
Je pense que l'on peut dire, sans aucun doute, que la migration d'Afrique
in the coming 20 years. So, in the horizon of any policy that makes sense. We can discuss each of the points later in the discussion if you're interested. Second, economic constraint. There is one reality, which is the huge revenue differential, income differential between Africa and Europe, between Sub-Saharan Africa or the southern part of Africa and Europe. It is 1 to 10, roughly. It has remained around 1 to 10 over the last 30 years. And this, of course, is a key determinant of migration pressures. And secondly, we already know the resources we are going to have to deal with the issue of migration and all other issues dealt with in EU cooperation with Africa. Basically, the funds have been maintained or frozen, as you prefer, but the funds have not increased as required by the European Commission. And for the next 7 years, we will have basically the same budget we had in the last 7 years. Third constraint, and very important, is a political constraint. Migration is still a very, very hot topic in Europe. It's going to remain as such in the coming years. And actually, I always remember, since we are in the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung hosting us with the Policy Center, I remember what Rita Süssmuth, the former president of the Bundestag of the National Parliament in Germany, told me after a very, very enlightened speech in favor of hosting refugees and migrants in Europe. I congratulated and thanked her, and she said, yes, my friend, but you don't know how difficult it is to win elections. And this is something that we shouldn't forget as well, the political constraint. 5 things not to do in this regard in the framework of the partnerships. Now I go down to the partnerships. First, to put migration in a state of emergency, to consider migration as an exception to everything else. Actually, this is the rationale behind the mobility partnerships, negotiating migration on a separate track than all other issues, and even more so the European Union Emergency Trust Fund for Africa to fight the root causes of irregular migration. And in these regards, it is important, I think, to overcome this rationale of partnerships in plural, and to understand that we should develop one partnership encompassing all different aspects of relation between Europe and Africa, and between Europe and North Africa. I can develop later if you want. Second, not to do thing, which seems to me very important, is the temptation of unilateral or bilateral solutions. We see a lot in the last 5 years in Africa. The European Union very clearly has gone that way, and I could give many examples. Migration, I just will say, migration is a regional and multilateral global issue, and it can only be dealt with in a global regional context. And to this extent, I fully support what Amal was saying before, the need to progress towards a more continent-to-continent discussion, and not to take advantage from European perspective of what Hassan was saying, the lack of regional integration in the Maghreb countries, in North Africa, and looking for different arrangements with Tunisia, with Libya, with Morocco, with Egypt, and so on and so forth. I think in the long term, this is also backfiring for the European Union. I can discuss it later. Third, not to do thing that seems to me key is to abdicate on values. In the last 5 years, unfortunately, we have seen too often that European governments and European Union have abdicated on basic universal values. For me, it is very clear that migration policy is a sovereignty issue. And of course, every state has the right to decide who stays in and who has the right to stay in its territory. This is clear. But it is clear too that this has to be differentiated from humanitarian assistance. And humanitarian assistance shouldn't make the difference between refugees or asylum seekers and economic migrants. Any person in need of assistance should be assisted. And this is important. And of course, the European Union shouldn't abdicate on values also in supporting governments who are not abiding by universal human rights obligations just because they control migration. And you can imagine what I'm referring to. Fourth, not to do thing which is very important right now is to sideline North Africa. There is a very clear trend of focusing on Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, because the perceived threats and potential migration or migration potential is much bigger from those countries, and somehow taking an instrumental approach to North African countries just as transit countries for these migration flows. They are transit countries, Hassan was explaining it before, but it is important not to dilute North Africa into the wider European-African partnership. North African countries have a very valuable experience of cooperation with the European Union and a very specific experience and track record in terms of migration management, and this shouldn't be left behind. And final, not to do thing that I think is important in the framework of the partnerships is to transfer the problems of Europe to third partners. This is what is called externalization today. In some ways, this is a logical approach, but it is a very problematic approach in terms of credibility for European partners. Now, from this, starting from this, what we know and what we shouldn't do, what can we do in the framework of the partnerships in the coming years between Europe and North Africa? I will just mention four key points. First, to promote legal pathways for migration. This is always the poor relative of every migration initiatives in Europe, including the last migration and asylum pact. I remember I coordinated a report for the European Parliament on exploring new avenues for legislation on labor migration in the European Union back in 2016. No progress has been made in this field. I mean, they are still discussing the reform of the Blue Card Directive 4 years later. And this issue of the legal pathways is fundamental for credibility issues and also to fight irregular migration. Second issue, mobility. Don't forget that they are mobility partnerships, actually, not migration and mobility partnerships. They are mobility partnerships. And mobility, we are too obsessed with in 2019, the 140,000 migrants who irregularly cross the Mediterranean, and we forget that 2.5 million migrants settled into the European Union in the same year, entering the EU territory through legal ways, even if they overstayed irregularly afterwards. And it is very important to normalize mobility, and also because this the visa policy of the European states is risking to create frustration in migrant populations in particular. This is very obvious already in a country like Algeria, to a lesser extent in Morocco and Tunisia. And this is a key dimension, in my opinion, of this issue in the framework of the partnerships. Third issue, to ensure quid pro quo, to ensure a balanced approach. I mean, you cannot aspire for third countries to readmit even their nationals if you don't give them incentives to do so. At the end, in terms of economic flows, a migrant is sending remittances back home, and a return migrant is creating a problem back home. So more balanced approach, not based only on principles, but also in economic incentives, could be useful in this framework. And final point, to reframe and recontextualize migration into the wider development discussion. And here I think it is important to, I will repeat myself, to overcome this partnerships approach. Mohammed has mentioned also the cacophony of many different partnership frameworks. And then the European Union proposes a EU comprehensive EU strategy with Africa with 5 different partnerships. No, you don't marry in 5 different marriages. You marry, and you marry with all elements of a marriage. You don't have 5 marriages, one for family, one for sex, one for earning home, and so on. And it is important to balance migration issues with other issues like access to European market or economic operations and other. I will stop here, but I think these are the, I would say, framework threads to build a partnership basket of Europe with the North African countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ivan Martin, and thank you so much to our esteemed panelists. I think you've all managed to capture the complexity of the issue and, you know, really show that there are different ways in which this can be looked at, and also the importance of contextualizing, you know, the issue of migration and how it can be addressed globally. So for now, we will open up the session for questions. We have a few questions that we've received via Facebook. They haven't been addressed to anybody specifically, so I will read out the questions, and any of the panelists can respond. So the first question is there an unsolved yet distressing, issue, how to develop a transnational legislative approach? So the question is, how can we develop a transnational legislative approach? Maybe I'll then ask the second question and let the panelists respond, and then we'll go for another round. The second question is, in recent decades, Morocco has gone from being a country of immigrants to an African migration route to Europe. Could Morocco become a destination country in itself? I will give the platform to our panelists to respond. I hope the questions were clear.
May I give a very short answer to the first question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, this issue of developing a transnational legislative approach to migration issues. Of course, this is the preferred approach, I would say, by all analysts. But I would say the political global context is not ready for that. We have seen a negotiation during 3 years of a global compact on migration. It was a very, very, very light and soft approach already from the very beginning, just trying to reach consensus, not to engage into any binding commitments, and still a few countries, actually 20-something countries, including a few members of the European Union, decided not to sign this global compact on migration in the framework of the United Nations. So I agree in the very same way that we have a convention on refugees and asylum in the framework of the United Nations, we should have some conventions for regulating international migration. We do already have some conventions that have not been ratified by more than 25, 30 countries worldwide. And I don't think that, unfortunately, the global context allows for this approach, this legislative transnational approach to migration right now. But this is the aspiration, of course.
Thank you, Martin. Do we have anybody else who wants to respond?
Yes, I would briefly add on the, or probably Mr. Hassan wanted to add, or Mr. Mohammed wanted to answer the first question, because I would rather ask the second one. So I'll give him the floor first.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Non, mais je vais dans le même sens de Ivan pour souligner deux points très rapidement. D'abord, sur le plan national, certains pays ne sont pas prêts, hein, je le dis, hein, ne sont pas prêts à mettre en place des législations concernant la gestion de la question migratoire. Donc, que dire d'appréhender la chose sur une échelle beaucoup plus large. Le deuxième point, c'est que il existe un cadre législatif, un cadre normatif, hein, et ça se réfère aux standards internationaux, les conventions internationales, elles sont là. Malheureusement, elles ne sont pas ratifiées par tous les pays. Alors, l'ambition ou bien l'objectif serait que tous les pays d'abord s'accordent à adopter et à ratifier tous ces textes internationaux qui sont quand même protecteurs des droits des migrants. Et à partir de là, on peut extrapoler petit à petit sur le plan national et harmoniser les législations. Donc, ce que je veux dire, c'est que commençons d'abord par adopter les textes internationaux qui sont assez protecteurs des droits des migrants.
International conventions that do provide an optimal level of protection for migrants' rights. Thank you. If I may speak, please.
Yes, you may go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Je voudrais réagir très rapidement à ces deux points. La première concernant la démarche transnationale législative. Vous savez que, par exemple, en Afrique du Nord, tous les pays d'Afrique du Nord, sauf la Tunisie, ont signé la Convention de 1990. Ceci dit, est-ce que la signature et l'adoption fait avancer les choses en matière de respect des droits humains des migrants ou au niveau de la gouvernance des migrations dans chacun des pays? Je ne crois pas. Donc, il me semble que, je veux dire, bien que, je veux dire, une fois qu'on signe, il y a un suivi.
Once one signs, there is a follow-up within the UN framework so as to implement the said covenants and conventions and protocols related thereto. But in North Africa, I do not see a major difference in the way one manages migration and one thinks migration between those countries that have signed and those who have not. It would be a sufficient enough subject for another debate. The second question was asked also by Morocco, but it is also a question that is ever facing Tunisia and Libya. You all know that Libya is a rate one destination country back in the first decade of the 20 of the years of the first in the beginning of the century. Libya was a migration country for Africa. When Libya started to welcome migrants from Africa in the wake of the embargo, Libya welcomed 2.5 million migrants, most of which were from Africa and Egypt. However, during this period, Libya had adopted a policy that incentivized migration and made migration, encouraged people to migrate. And after starting in 2011, migration has started becoming a problem considering the armed groups that operate in Libya as well as the chaos that prevails therefore. And it's turned Libya into a country where serious violations are being committed. And I look at Tunisia and Morocco as countries of destination. It has to stem from a real will. When you put forth the status of destination country for migrants in Sub-Saharan Africa, you would put a lot of emphasis, even in trust funds programs, on the protection of migrants, on fighting vulnerabilities. There are a number of programs that were designed to protect sub-Saharan migrants in North Africa. who are settled in North Africa. But as we've discussed this issue extensively, the issue is that there are not enough resources or funds dedicated to mitigating the deep causes of illegal migration to North Africa, not even for the nationals of North African countries. And I therefore think that this new status or pretended status is a trap in a way. I believe that we should move towards can-do policies to welcome migrants from the south of the Sahara in our own countries with in line with the desire to have very strong relations between North African countries and countries south of the Sahara. And I imagine also that our friends from CAS or within the New South Center, they know, because this issue is also of tremendous importance to the extent where there are some reservations in North African countries, so as to use the adoption of asylum laws internally so that they would be instrumentalized by EU countries so as to turn North African countries into processing places for those migrants instead of having them come to shore on the other side. So this issue is full of mines and full of traps that one should be adept at avoiding within a can-do policy on migration within the countries of North Africa and well within the region once the region is built.
Thank you. So Amal, I'll give you the floor to respond to the second question. Thank you.
Yes, and probably briefly add to the first question. In the context of Africa, I think that the hindrance to a transnational approach on migration would be first the question of sovereignty, and Mr. Ivan Martin has spoke on it, and I think it's also valid for the case of Africa, because of course every state would like to have full sovereignty on accepting the people that they want on their territory. And also the second problem is the problem of identity. And if you follow, like the movements around, for example, the Western Mediterranean route, we see that one of the main problems is the fact that people are undocumented. When they arrive to Spain, for example, they destroy their IDs, and you cannot even know if they come from, which country from Sub-Saharan Africa. So how are you gonna return them, to their countries of origin, even if their countries are willing to admit them? So, it's very complicated. And for the second question, of course, I think that Morocco is de facto becoming a destination country, but now some people are asking the question, is it a destination of choice or is it a destination of obligation? We cannot know. I mean, most probably people who left from Africa, their destination of choice would be Europe, but they end up in Morocco. But still, they would be able to settle in Morocco. And just to rethink about the number of 50,000 people who were regularized, among them were migrants, were refugees, and they were granted a residence permit, which means that they could benefit from health services, they could benefit from accessing the basic public services in Morocco. And in itself, it's not an incentive to actually, settle down in Morocco or anything, but still it's a very important step towards the regularization and towards just giving these people a chance to have a life in Morocco. Whether they choose or they did not choose to end up in Morocco, they can still, integrate to the society. And I think that it's becoming noticeable. The people from different origins, from Syria, from Iraq, from Sub-Saharan Africa, who are living in Morocco, and they're becoming of the economic and social tissue. Now, that does not mean that there are no challenges. Challenges are very important, and as Mr. Boubacar said before, even for citizens of Northern African countries, there are a lot of challenges. So, of course, for the migrants who end up settling down in these countries, they face pretty much the same challenges or even more, as they'll have to prove themselves and to access the labor market.
Thanks, Amal. So our third question is, how has COVID-19 impacted on the sub-Saharan migration dynamics towards North Africa and therefore towards Europe? Any takers?
Yes, yes. Yes, I have some elements which I can add. Oui, excusez-moi. J'ai parlé en anglais. Oui, juste par rapport à la COVID, je dirais que
COVID-19, I would say we've had a real wave, a real explosion of illegal migration from by Tunisian nationals towards Italy. We're not far from about 10,000 Tunisian nationals who have made the crossing to Italy since June. This leads to a lot of problems. On the one hand, between Tunisia, and on the other, Italy and the EU. Maybe Mohammed spoke to this, but it just goes to say that the vulnerability and the fragility of the economy and social situation in Tunisia was worsened by the impact of the COVID-19 on Tunisia. Just looking at the bilateral axes between Tunisia and Italy and the Europe at large has totally disrupted existing schemes, because Tunisians represent actually the first community of those who cross into Italy. Another direct impact is that throughout the period between May, June, and April, when Tunisia was less affected by the COVID-19 crisis and when Algeria was even more affected, we had noticed that we had a number of sub-Saharan nationals who had crossed the land border between Algeria and Tunisia, sometimes forcefully because they were fighting economic precarity or fragility in Algeria, and they came through to Tunisia believing that tourism will reopen and business will resume. And that's why we had a great number or a considerable number of sub-Saharan migrants who were settled in Algeria and who had forcefully entered Tunisia to try their luck in Tunisia and also to flee from the poverty they suffered in Algeria. So that's a direct impact. And also for Libya, the COVID crisis and the existing instability was such that there were an increasing number of crossings from sub-Saharan migrants from Libya to Tunisia. So this is an intra-North African issue which affects our relationship with the EU. But maybe because Sub-Saharan Africa was not impacted considerably, significantly by COVID, we did not see major movements of population from Sub-Saharan Africa onto North Africa. And maybe I'll refer to what my colleagues and friends know about this, but this is simply what I was able to observe, or the info I was able to collect on the impact COVID had on North African countries. Is simply the way local governments and states have managed the crisis, and how migrants that were already settled in North Africa were helped or provided with assistance in those countries. But that's a different ballgame, and it may be an experience worthy of being shared on our platform.
Yes, you may go ahead, Mr. Liman.
If I may. True, the management of the Sub-Saharan community in North African countries, and notably in Tunisia, is not absolutely, or uh, it's not directly involved in this debate, but a sizable part of this sub-Saharan community is illegally present in Tunisia simply because they had projects to make the crossing onto Europe. And I believe it is important to underscore that during the period of this crisis, we have had a show of solidarity, an extraordinary show of solidarity on the part of civil society. Already these migrants live in precarious conditions, and with COVID, with the curfews, with the lockdowns, and all of the restrictions that came about, be they restrictions related to employment or to movement or mobility, there was a show of solidarity from civil society, but also, and that is very important to underscore, there was also the response of the Ministry of Human Rights that has called on adopting a law that would, an amnesty to make all illegal migrants present in Tunisia become legal. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. If we have no one who has anything to add, I will move on to the next question. Okay. The next question is, can we expect North African countries to play the migration card towards Europe much more proactively in the coming years?
I can answer if you want. Definitely.
Go ahead.
Yes, I think. Yeah, this is something that has been even made explicit, in particular by Moroccan authorities. I remember already back in 2017, the Minister of Agriculture of the government of Morocco stating publicly that the migration flows was basically an European problem. It had a lot of costs and implications for Morocco. And if Europe was not ready to come forward with support for Morocco in this respect, they would act in consequence. So when I was asked not very long ago to summarize the development of relations between Morocco and the European Union, I certainly think that there has been an inversion of negotiating bargaining power, and now Morocco has a much stronger elements to negotiate with the European Union. And well, Tunisia is more difficult, of course, because the transition and the lack of political stability makes that actually governments are rotating once and again, and the external policy and bargaining power is limited anyway, I think. But overall, I definitely think that this can be the case.
Thank you so much. I will take the last question before I ask our panelists to give us final closing remarks. The last question is how to convert the legal framework that fosters the cooperation between North Africa and EU into an effective action plan. Any takers from our panelists?
Pour répondre, non, mais pour commenter, oui.
Answer, certainly not, but commenting, yes, I can. And I will. Earlier, we said the policies for the opening of the employment market of Europe to the North African remains relatively reluctant, if not hesitant. But fact is, when you look at the mobility agreement, mobility partnership agreements as proposed by the European Union to the North African countries, you will see that organized migration is not high on the agenda of the different agreements. And it is being said here and there, not directly, but we don't really see a strong keenness or willingness to make work migration of the nationals of North African countries to Europe, to turn it into, to make it a leverage of these mobility agreements and a leverage, if not a lever, of these agreements also as part of the good neighborhood policy. It is being said either intra-sectoral, when we talk about the employment policy or international employment, but not in the management of mobility. That is not being said clearly, openly. It is not really put high on the agenda of these agreements, or as they are not being put as strategic axes of these agreements. So there are rather the fight and irregular migration, the readmissions, and the facilitation of visa obtention. It is not the organizing of a regular migration of African countries to Europe. Another poor cousin or sick child is the policy. We're talking about the European policies, but we don't really talk enough, at least in North Africa, about the dynamics of managing migration in the African, or by the African Union and by the RECs, the regional economic communities. But we've said that before. I don't really feel that at the political level in North Africa, we are aware enough of the way in which the African Commission or European Commission is thinking about the mobility question. Last year, or was it before, was validated the African passport. Hence, the question of the free circulation of Africa, of a single market, and a free and single market is on the table. Work is in progress, and we know there is a lot of reluctance, not to say opposition, of many countries, members of the African Union and the members of the regional economic communities. But I think that in North Africa, we need to really refocus on, from the side of North African policy in charge, both in Morocco and Tunisia, but more in Tunisia and Morocco, because those who lead the migration in Africa are in Morocco. So maybe we need to really better account for this dynamic of the new framework of governance. A document has been published 2 years ago in 2018 by the African Union, i.e. the framework of the governance of migration in Africa. And I think that North African countries, it is in their interest to, again and always, look at these documents and address this dynamic, at least to rebalance their relations with the European Union. I'd like to also add the following. As to the question of mobility, there are two tiers. The first tier, what is being negotiated within the Partnership for Mobility Agreements and the interest of the European Union and its member states. For the first tier, if not level, respecting the negotiations within the framework of the Partnership for Mobility. When we talk about mobility or work migration, we are referring to the long stay visa, whereas the visa for long duration stay is not part of the competencies or the prerogatives of the European Union. The European Union cannot negotiate the work migration or long duration stay visa on behalf of the member state. It is a competence which is exclusively in the hands of the member state of the European Union. Hence, what we are negotiating within the framework of the Partnership for Mobility is the short stay visa, the tourist visa. That is the first tier. The long stay visa and the economic quote unquote visa is excluded from the negotiations. It has to be done as an aside on a bilateral basis with the member states of the European Union. The second element in this very logic within the framework of the Partnership of Mobility is that even if the European Union is not directly having the powers and the wherewithal, it insists in its communication on the question of community preferences, i.e., it indicates to the member states the following: if you are going to choose in the work migration or migration for work, you should discriminate in favor. Another way, give privilege to the citizens of the European Union or the European citizens. So there is this community preference which is having the upper hand or prevailing. That's the second, that's the first level. Now the second level, and this has been confirmed with the new pact or agreement on the 23rd of September. It is being openly stated, if not the European Union and the member states too, as it reads, should try to have the knowledge and know-how of the European Union and its member states at play in order to attract talents and to scout talents from North African countries. So the mobility is being seen here only in one way. We are going only to cherry pick the talents. So these are the persons we need. If need be, if push comes to shove, we will be also need the mobility of technicians, engineers, including the healthcare practitioners, nurses, and also the medical personnel. So when the European Union talks about the mobility here again, it really conceives of the mobility within the interest of the European Union, but not within a win-win logic. So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ivan, I'll give you 1 minute to give your comment.
Okay, very quickly. I come back to this question of the action plan. I mean, we are not constructing a car. I mean, if you want to construct a car, you produce an action plan and with very clear procedures, and you produce the car. This is a very complex issue, a structural issue with contradictory interests, contradictory perceptions. So I don't think that we need even an action plan, because we don't have common objectives to act on. I think we need to normalize the issue of migration and to calm down the many heated debate around this. I have indicated, and Hassan has taken up the issue of legal migration, legal labor migration. I think mobility is a key issue as well. And I think the balance of interest in any agreement is fundamental as well. And then to frame migration into the wider development debate. I don't think that we should focus and find an action plan for migration. No, we have to think what world we want together, North Africa and Europe in the future. Overall, in terms of employment, in terms of development, in terms of social values and so on. And migration is one of the dimensions of the pathway to this world. And if we keep focusing on migration as a state of emergency, exceptional issue, I don't think that we are going to progress much. I stop here.
So much, Mr. Ivan. We've come to the end of our webinar. I would like to extend sincere gratitude to our panelists, panel of experts, for the thought-provoking insights that they've provided to us. I think they've clearly contextualized some of the issues on migration and mobility in the context of North Africa and Europe, and also providing insights on some of the strategies, especially within the African context, that can be employed to bridge this gap, and also some of the partnerships that can be fostered between EU and North Africa and the implications thereof. Thank you so much again for your time and for participating in the webinar. Also like to thank the Policy Center for the New South and CAS for providing this platform to us. And also we would like to thank, of course, our audience for joining in on the ride with us. Hopefully you learned a lot and hopefully it was an engaging session. This is all for us from me, Slindile, who was your moderator today. Thank you so much for joining us and have a lovely day, evening, or night, wherever you are. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Merci à vous.